Okay, I want to welcome everyone. It's 10:30 here, Mountain Standard Time. So I want to go ahead and get started so we have plenty of time. I want to welcome everyone to session P3. This is a live teaching demonstration entitled Team Writing as WAC Practice. And we're lucky to have two presenters and educators with us here today. The first of which will be Joanna Wolf, and I will turn it over to her now.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, and good morning, afternoon, or evening to you wherever you are. And I and Maria Fewer are going to be talking about team writing as WAC practice and sharing with you some of the innovations, new things that we have implemented in teaching students to collaboratively write as part of a team. So we have three goals. I want to illustrate how team writing can be part of WAC instruction. I want to introduce a model for a flipped WAC workshop. And by WAC workshop, I mean where a writing expert comes and delivers writing content, writing instruction in a disciplinary class that is not devoted to writing. And by flipped, I mean a workshop where part of the material is given in advance of actually meeting with the students so that class time can be dedicated to active hands-on learning. And finally, we want to share our resources with you, which we'll be doing towards the end of the session. And we would love if you would like to play around with some of what we've created and give us some feedback on how it works in your institutional context. First, let me give you a little bit of background about our institution and our writing center, or a formal writing center, because the funding for the Global Communications Center was cut as part of pandemic-related budget cuts. But prior to that, we were a very vibrant writing center and writing in the disciplines outreach center. And in addition to providing many one-on-one individual writing consultations, we provided over 80 instructional workshops directly in disciplinary classes. And that's in addition to another 40 workshops that we provided outside, disconnected from the classroom. Of those workshops, our workshop on team communication was consistently, year after year, one of our most requested. And it was often combined with one of these others that are also up on the screen. And with this, sometimes it would be combined in a single class, sometimes combined across multiple classes. We come in for 2 or 3 sessions to teach students how to write a paper in their discipline, or best practices for designing a presentation on their particular topic. And this workshop was particularly popular in applied disciplines, and in disciplines where teamwork on written documents was the norm, not the exception. And this context within our discipline reflects a national context where collaboration and teamwork are becoming increasingly desirable skills. This data here is from the National Bureau of Economics Research, and it has categorized job descriptions based on the type of skill that the position is requesting. As you can see here, the major growth in the economy is in jobs that require social skills, which includes communication as well as teamwork and collaboration. And that outpaces jobs that require analytic skills or that require just STEM skills. Though the highest growth in the economy is jobs that require both of these, both social and analytical, technical reasoning skills. And this makes sense because as our world is becoming increasingly complex, increasingly interconnected, we more and more need an ability to collaborate with others who have a different expertise, a complementary perspective from us. And the people who are really successful in today's economy are the people who can get information from others and combine that and collaborate with others to reach a common goal. But even even as this is becoming more and more central to our economy, our education is not really keeping up with this. And so based on a large-scale survey of employers, while over 80% of the employers believe that teamwork is an essential skill, only 37% agree that we are graduating students who are well prepared in this area. The findings are pretty similar in terms of oral and written communication. There's a major gap between what employers see as important and what they feel that colleges are graduating. Now, this lack of preparation that the employers are perceiving is also reflected in the student projects themselves. So Elizabeth Powell and I surveyed over 650 engineering undergraduates at 3 different institutions and asked them about problems they had experienced on a team project in the past year. And engineering, of course, being a very applied discipline. Over 85% of them reported a problem in the past year. And moreover, when we break this down by the types of problems that students are experiencing, we see some very disturbing patterns. So many of the presentations at this conference have focused on issues of equity and social justice. And we see in these team projects some of the inequities, some of the imbalances of power that are present in our larger society, reflected in the microcosms of these teams. So when we ask students about the type of problem they experienced, a slacker teammate was the most commonly reported problem, and that was a relatively equal opportunity problem. A slacker teammate is a teammate who is perceived as not showing up or not doing their part or kind of slacking off on the project. But when we look at these last 3 here, these are of particular concern. So a domineering teammate is a teammate who interrupts or silences or dismisses somebody else's contribution. Limited learning. Over half of the women on these projects perceived themselves as having limited learning opportunities on the project because of the role that they were assigned. And women in technical settings often get consigned to what they refer to as more secretarial roles, more organizational roles, more writing roles, and less technical roles. And 40% of the women that we surveyed felt that they had been excluded from the main work of the team. And when we break this data down by race, the pattern gets even worse, is even more amplified, with 56% of Black, Hispanic, or Native American students reporting having experienced a domineering teammate who dismissed or silenced their contributions. 54% of them felt that they had limited learning opportunities on the project. Almost half of them felt they were excluded from the main work of one of the team projects they had been on in the past year. This is really concerning. This cuts to the heart of the educational enterprise. If students on these teams are having fewer educational opportunities, less educational access because of their team projects. So from a social justice perspective, from an equity perspective, this is something where we really want to intervene on projects. And so I want to invite you all to reflect on how these problems occur and how we might minimize these problems. I'm going to do this by showing you a vignette of a team of really well-meaning students in a project that goes awry. And so I'm going to queue up my volunteers in just a second, and they're going to read this vignette. And when we're done, I'm going to ask you what went wrong. So let me queue up Pam, Jesse, and Maria. And so this is a team of Rajit, Lauren, and Michael, who are really excited to get started on a project for their engineering class. Michael, can you take it away?
Okay, so we need to submit a proposal for this project in 2 weeks. Why don't I work on the intro? Raji, you write the solution, and Lauren, you can do the conclusion. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
That works, but I might need some feedback on my draft. Sometimes I can make grammatical mistakes.
That's fine. Just email it to us before the deadline and we'll edit it.
So, a day before the project deadline, Rajit sends an email to his teammates, asking them to review his section. And the following day, the group meets to discuss the proposal.
Hey, Rajit, can you look over the final proposal, make sure everything's good? We only have an hour before we need to email it to the professor.
Sure. Hey guys, so I'm looking at the proposal here, and did you completely rewrite my section?
Yeah, you said you wanted us to edit it.
There were some grammatical mistakes, so we had to rephrase it.
But everything is completely rewritten. I spent a long time writing that, and all of the main points are completely gone. The process makes no sense now, and the explanations are completely inaccurate.
We had to rewrite all that stuff. It didn't fit with the research that Lauren and I did. So we just adapted some of what you said to our sections.
I didn't think we did that much to your section. We just moved some things around and made it more like the sample the professor uploaded.
What sample? I've written reports like these in my other classes, so I know what it's supposed to look like.
Sorry, Rajit, we feel kind of bad, but we had no choice. We literally only had one day to fix it.
We only saw your email last night. Just figured it'd be easier if we revised it ourselves.
The proposal literally makes no sense now. I wish we figured this out earlier.
Thank you. Thank you so much to my volunteers. Thank you, Pam and Jesse and Maria. So the question I have for you as the audience members is, what went wrong? And you can probably identify multiple problems, multiple things that went wrong. But I'd like you to go ahead and share in the chat, what do you see as the single biggest problem with this team? So I would like you all, audience members, to write in the chat, what do you see as the single biggest problem with this team? Okay, so I'm seeing lots of things on communication, that there's no clear goals. There's not teamwork. Yeah, their understanding of what teamwork is skewed. They don't have a good sense of what revision entails, rewriting versus feedback. There's no roles or actual discussion of process. They don't all share the same goals for what the project should look like, and they don't have a plan to execute them. Excellent. Now, before I go on to the analysis that Maria and I have of this, I just want to point out that on this vignette that we just see, it illustrates many of the common problems that we just saw. So certainly we can anticipate that Lauren or Michael might label Rajit as a slacker teammate, because after all, they had to rewrite his section. And we might anticipate that they might be a little resentful, even though we understand that Rajit did his work on time, did good quality, or did what he perceived as good quality work. We could forgive Rajit for perceiving of his teammates as domineering, as silencing his perspective. We could definitely expect him to think that he had been excluded from the work of the project because his section wasn't included in there. And as teachers, I think we could all see the limited learning opportunities that occurred on this team. all these chances for them to learn from each other that are completely eclipsed by the way that they have structured and planned this project. So as I ask you, what went wrong? Okay, the number one thing that we see going wrong on this, and many of the issues that this team faces, are variations on a failure to plan and a failure to communicate plans up front. And there was no plan for the recursive nature of writing, no plan for review, no plan for feedback, no plan to act on that feedback. Those two were collapsed, seen almost as identical. So I want to invite you to imagine a world where this group did plan. There would be a timeline for review and revision, and that would be expanded. So that would actually be budgeted in the team's project. The group would have discussed in advance how they were going to make these revisions. Would feedback be delivered in a face-to-face meeting, and then people would go back and revise their own sections? Would someone revise the whole thing? And ideally, the group would have taken the time to discuss their goals up front and discuss what the final product should look like before they even get started. Now, I would say that this focus on planning is the major lesson of my textbook on team writing. And this textbook provides lots of documents that students need to work on in order to get them to be on the same page and to coordinate their work. And these documents include task schedules. This is a timeline of the project, who is going to do work, what work, by when, and ideally a task schedule with budget time for review, feedback, and revision. And this is a major lesson of the team writing book. Team charters is a document where groups establish the norms for how they will behave and act and discuss some of their goals for their project up front. Meeting agenda, of course, are goals for meetings that include both what needs to happen before the meeting and what the intended outputs of the meeting are, what will happen after. Now, for years, I've cajoled students, please do these things. We've provided horror stories of teams that didn't use them. We've provided quotes from professionals who said, of course, use them. And still, getting students to invest in this kind of planning was like pulling teeth. And when Maria surveyed, to be more specific, students after the projects were over, of the teams where students were not required to use these documents, only about a third of them reported actually using them. And when students were asked why they didn't use them, the answers were kind of predictable. They said things like, it seemed like it would take too much time, or we started it, but then we just didn't update it, or it didn't seem necessary because my teammates all seemed reliable. Now, to be fair to these students, we also got some feedback from many of them, like, yeah, in retrospect, I really wish I had used that. I see how that would have made a difference. But getting them to actually do so was a challenge. And moreover, not do we just have low quantities of students actually using and following through on what we had taught them, but the quality of the task schedules and the team charters that they produced was often quite facile. Up on the screen here is a Gantt chart that one student team produced. And it's an example of a task schedule. As you can see here, just by looking at these purple bars on the screen, this is a very simplistic idea of the task. It makes it look very nice, neat, and contained. And the group has thought through when things should start and when they should end. But we don't see any of that recursive process. We don't see even assigning roles on this or any plan for what's going to happen if any one of these deliverables needs some additional work. Students have a faith that they're all on the same page at the start of the project. And this is also reflected in the team charters. Students seem to assume that other people viewed the world from the same perspective that they did. And so they approach teamwork from this kind of right-wrong mentality. So for instance, in this charter at the top of the screen, the team ranks, each team member agrees to treat other team members with the respect, kindness, and sincerity that they themselves expect to be treated with, without any awareness that something that one person sees as respectful or disrespectful might not even be an issue or something that's on other people's radar. So there's an assumption that we all share the same goals and values. And if we look at the one on the bottom, there's an assumption that you all know, your teammates know what's right. And anything that goes wrong on the project is therefore the consequence of someone deliberately letting the team down. And I saw this a lot in interviews with students when we would show a vignette or scenario where someone turned in something that was poor quality. The students would immediately leap to, oh my God, I must have slacker teammates, as opposed to, maybe there was a misunderstanding, or maybe I'm missing something, or maybe there are different goals for this. And so this team here just assumes if someone turns in poor quality work, it's a result of laziness. And that person knows what they did and should own up to that. So these very sort of universalistic mindsets that were inhibiting any kind of planning, because students didn't really see a need to plan if they thought that everybody shared the same perspective. So Maria took it upon herself as part of her dissertation to revise how we were delivering these workshops. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn this over to Maria and let you go ahead and share. You're great.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was muted. My name is Maria Ford, and I'll be taking over from here. Thank you, Joanna, for setting us up with the problem and sort of the significance and gaps of everything that we've sort of been looking at. So as Joanna had mentioned, our business, so we were sort of in the business of trying to figure out how we can get students to use these team documents and to plan better for feedback, revision, and general just better communication on their teams. So what we did with the flipped workshop is the following. We split it up into two components, an at-home component, and then also an in-class component. And the at-home component consisted of two modules. So the first module, we asked students to begin unpacking some of their personal assumptions and expectations for the project and also for teamwork in general. So that vignette that Pam, Jesse, and I read earlier about Rajit and his team, we asked students to read that vignette and then to respond to it with what are some things that they noticed that were perhaps unproductive on the team and were preventing the team from really reaching their potential. Then we provided them with an alternative universe vignette where we showed how this team could actually plan and how different their interaction and their project could look if they planned ahead of time. So we focused our module and sort of the helping students unpack expectations on 4 key team aspects, and those included team and personal goals, feedback and revision, values around time, and then also commitment levels. And then after students responded to scenarios on those 4 key aspects, we then turned it over to them to begin thinking about their own values and expectations. How might they respond to common value-based conflicts? And once they documented their answers and their expectations, those answers were then submitted as part of the Google form in Module 1, and all of the teams' answers were collected into one I guess, repository where they could compare later on. Now, what we did in Module 1, I want to show you an example of one of these scenarios that we provided with students. So this scenario is on time values. So we asked students to read the scenario, and it goes as follows. Rajit and his team are scheduled to meet at 2 p.m. It's 2 p.m. and Rajit is in the room already. However, his teammates haven't shown up yet. So then we ask students to think about their preferences for timeliness and to answer the following question. Your meeting is scheduled at 2 p.m. At what point do you think your peer is being inconsiderate when they show up? So we try to get students to try to unpack, oh, I never really thought about, if my teammate shows up 10 minutes late, then that is the worst thing that they could possibly do. Here I am waiting for them. I took time out of my day to show up on time. My teammate is late. Whereas somebody else might think that, oh, if you show up 20 minutes late, it's not a big deal. I'll just sit here and do my work while, by the time waiting for you to arrive. So it really gets students to start thinking about, what are the things that might bother them? What are the things that they value? What are some pain points that they might have around teamwork, and specifically around those 4 key aspects that we had talked about. So in module 2, what we did is we began teaching students how to use task schedules to begin planning for their team project. So as Joanna had mentioned, task schedules are where students can unpack the tasks, deliverables, the roles, deadlines, feedback and revision points, etc. for their project. So this is where they begin kind of delving into the nitty-gritty of the project itself to begin to figure out what are the different components that they need to complete, who will complete them, when and where do they need to include review and revision points, and really begin planning for even the possibility of conflict and mistakes and the feedback that needs to go along with it. So we asked students to first look at a sample from Rajit and their team, and we showed them this is what a task schedule can look like. That a task schedule that shows all of the different components of a project that are split up across the different team members, the different agenda and meeting points, the different review points throughout the project, and then also how they are assessing the progress of the team. And what we did here is we showed students that you can sort of rank the progress of your project and the progress of the different deliverables based on sort of a bronze, silver, and gold quality assessment system. And we kind of think it's sort of like a fun way to, to help students track that progress. So we show students an example of a well-planned task schedule for Rajit's group. Then we give students a video to watch that showcases how they can go about unpacking their assignment and begin planning for their project. And then the last part of module 2 is where students create their own task schedule on their own, where they begin to unpack what do they think the project should look like? What are the different components that they think the project should include? And once again, similar to module 1, their submissions are gathered up together into one sort of repository where everybody submits their task schedules, and later on they will compare with their team members. So here we are at module 3. So module 3 is the component of the workshop where students meet together in their team to share what their values and expectations and goals are for the project based on what they answered in modules 1 and 2. So just to kind of give you a brief overview again, module 1 and 2 students did on their own to unpack their own expectations and assumptions. Module 3 is where they share their ideas and share their answers, and then they begin to practice merging those things together. Now, we realized over the course of our research that merging competing values is something that's really difficult for students to do, that it can sometimes create awkward situations where students feel like they don't want to offend a peer, or that they don't want to come across as not valuing their peers' perspective if they think of something differently. Or sometimes they are worried about repercussions if they say something that's different from what their peers think. So we really thought about what are some ways that we can get students to be a little bit more comfortable with sharing possibly competing values and possibly divergent perspectives. And what we did is we created a low stakes and non-face threatening exercise where students practice compromising with Rajid's team. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And then after they practice that on Rajid's team, then they begin applying that into their own team charters and their own task schedules. So let me sort of show you what this looks like. So here we gave students a scenario on, once again, attitudes towards time. And the scenario reads as follows. Rajit and his teammates do not have the same attitudes towards time. For Rajit, who is the project manager, it's really important to be punctual and start meetings on time. For Michael and Lauren, it's important to have some flexibility around time. So then we asked students, what are some ways that Rajit and his group can compromise and integrate different time values into their team's culture? Remember, there are no right or wrong answers. So we give students some options, as you can see here, on some ways that they can help the team, Rajit's team, compromise in this situation. And students can choose out of these 4 options. They discuss them on their own, but they can also choose something that's completely different as well. So this is a way to prompt students to begin compromising and realize that maybe it's not as scary as it seems, that, at the end of the day, you have some ways that you can either come up with a consensus that will work for the entire team, or sometimes integrate different perspectives and accommodate different perspectives throughout the project. So then we get to the point where students are then sharing their own values from Module 1 and from Module 2. So here's an example where we ask students to think back on their own preferences for timeliness. And we say, for instance, your meeting is scheduled for 2 p.m. At what point do you think your peer is being inconsiderate when they show up? And here students need to discuss as a team what their individual preferences were, and then try to come up with a compromise, something that would work for the entire team. And we found some really interesting responses from students, where students would sometimes say, well, it kind of depends on the situation. Sometimes, it's okay if you show up 15 minutes late if it's not necessarily, an important meeting, but other times it's very important for you to be there when the meeting starts. But ultimately what we found is that students were much more nuanced, and also they really integrated their perspectives into the team charters this time around. So let me show you some data as to what we found in our analyses. So when we looked at the use of task schedules, we found that it increased quite significantly from the original workshop to the flipped workshop. In the original workshop, only about a third of students used task schedules on their own, unprompted, whereas in the flipped workshop, 75% of students used it for their teams. Similarly, with the team charters, we saw an increase from 38% of students using it on their own, unprompted, to 73% of students using it in their projects. And what we also did is we looked at team charters themselves to try to see what was going on in the charters. How might they have been different from the original workshop? And what we found is that they improved quite significantly, especially on these following categories. So teams end up taking a much more nuanced approach to teamwork. They were much more attentive to context and how in different situations you might need to adapt your responses to those situations, that there is no black and white, right or wrong response, which was very different from what we saw in the original workshop. Teams also really worked to create a psychologically safe environment that prioritized improvement, that prioritized asking for help and offering help, and then really prioritized collaboration at the end of the day, which is what we want students to be doing. And we also found that students really worked to integrate different perspectives and really work to accommodate different values that their teammates had, and to try to find mutually agreeable compromises. We also found that students use much more empathetic discourse in their team charters, which was definitely something we were very excited to see. So we saw students use a lot less punitive language. So as you remember, Joanna showed the example of the students in the team charter blaming their peer and sort of assigning blame to students who made mistakes, that they were somehow at fault. So we saw a lot less of that language and a lot less of the absolutist and universalist language in the team charters. Students paid much more attention to context, as I had mentioned previously. They discussed divergent perspectives, had more attempts at compromise, and we also saw much more hedging and explanations for why decisions were being made. So to show you some examples of what this looks like in the charters themselves. So whereas in previous, in the original workshop, we saw that absolutist, universalist language, sort of assuming that peers would know what it means for everyone to be treated the way that you want to be treated. There are a lot of underlying assumptions here. In the post-workshop, what we saw is that students were really explicitly unpacking what each individual wants to see throughout the project, what each individual's values are. So here the teammates write, H wants her team to achieve a good outcome that showcases dedication, engagement, efficient teamwork, good communication, and relevant information, whereas M wants her team to learn new issues related to the proposal and discussing effective and feasible solutions alongside establishing clear goals and problems in the beginning. Hence, both H and M believe that the work should be thorough, including all the relevant information and setting a clear goal. And the things I want you to pay attention here is some of the discourse strategies that students are using, where they are outlining the individual perspectives and then trying to come up with, once again, that compromise or a way of merging the two approaches together. Now, the other example I wanted to show you here is, whereas in the previous workshops, we saw that punitive language, we saw, attributing blame to students for purposefully submitting poor quality work, as if it's sort of an inherent part of their personality that they did something wrong, versus it just being a naturally occurring part of teamwork. In the post workshop, in the post charters, what we saw is that students were focusing less on the writer themselves and that the writer is at fault, but more on how can we make improvements? What is the procedure that we can outline to offer feedback, to help our peers improve, and to make this project better? We see a lot more empathetic language built into helping team members improve rather than assigning blame and punishing them for their work. So I want to end by giving you some resources that Joanna had actually mentioned at the beginning of the workshop. So the first link will take you to a document that outlines each of the 3 modules and takes you to a Google form for each of the 3 modules. So you'll be able to access the modules that we used, and feel free to use them in your own classrooms. And as Joanna said, if you have any feedback, we would love to hear how it worked in your classes and in your institutions. We're always looking to improve the work that we're doing. I'm also giving you a link to the sample task schedule and the template that we used in Module 2 and the example that I showed you in the work in our presentation, and then also a link to the video that we gave students on how to create a task schedule. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. We really enjoyed presenting our work to you, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you. So many of you see I've typed the main link in the chat, and you can access these other links by downloading our slides from the main page. And I think that the video is, all the other ones are embedded within the modules. Anyway, it just takes a little bit more digging around. We would love to hear what questions or thoughts are crossing your mind, or alternatively, we can give you a few minutes to kind of poke around in the modules and see what questions you come up with.
So I actually have a question, and I usually don't ask questions in these, but I have one that I'm really curious about. And this is more like peer review related, but when they're interacting with each other, right? So I teach freshman composition, and I have some problems sometimes with peer review or joint work where one person does routinely do less or not give back as much. And I'm wondering if you think a solution, some people will pair groups that are on the same kind of track academically with each other, right? Like similarly situated students. I always kind of want to open it up, but I don't know how to kind of, without totally turning a student off from peer review completely, I don't know how to motivate them to actually be invested in the process as part of a team. And I think it's really important. So I was just wondering if you guys had any advice on that.
Maria, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to take that one. This actually is very similar to some of the challenges that I experienced that led me to this research. Specifically, I found that when I placed students who had different levels of English proficiency together on a team, they had a really hard time figuring out how to offer feedback to one another and how to make the project work for them. And what I found is essentially everything that you see here is kind of the result of, all like the trial and error that went into how can I get students to be more, feel like they have more control over the peer review process, as you mentioned, more control over, how they want to give feedback. So I guess the suggestion I might give is ask students, what do they want to achieve in the peer review process? That's one thing that I found that really worked with my students. Getting students to try to think about like, okay, well, I want feedback on the content, for instance, stay away from everything else. I really want just feedback on the ideas, or having somebody else say, like, I want feedback more on the structure. But really articulating what their expectations are and what their needs are to their peers, I found to be really, really helpful, rather than even me as a teacher coming in and saying, like, make sure you do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. So that's something that I found to be really helpful with students, especially when there are those, you mentioned, on different academic tracks, but I think that is very similar to what I found with students having different linguistic proficiencies, really articulating what they want to achieve from the feedback process, which once again, we found is really hard to do, and kind of prompting students to think about it ahead of time before they go into that situation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And I'll just go ahead and comment on it, because one thing that the workshop does is it kind of normalizes revision. And that scenario with Rajit, that's how the workshops, the modules start off. We show the bad scenario, and then we say, okay, let's do the rewind and show a good scenario. And I think that really helps bring students into that. And those scenarios, that was a lot of work on Maria's part. She went through many iterations of it to kind of simplify things and really get in a quick time span the main problems and the better alternative future that we wanted to put in front of students in there. The posted slides are just it's called the presentation, but I have now copied all 3 of the links that are in the slides into the chat. Let me go back and I will look at some of these other questions and comments in the chat, but if someone would like to just speak up, that would also be lovely. Barney asked, do you find it important, useful to teach students about roles that can be played in collaborative groups? Absolutely. That is part of the task schedule. We recommend that everybody on the project develop or take on some sort of expertise or some sort of lens that they look through the project as. So maybe someone's the visual expert or the client expert. And so every time, or they're the data expert, and every time they look at the project, they're looking at other people's work through that particular expertise, even if it's just an adopted expertise, and that becomes a reason, a rationale for revising, for giving each other feedback, and it kind of shows students, how they can gain new perspectives from their teammates.
I think Joanna Johnson had a question. How long do you allocate for the workshop and associated work and reflection? Do you return to it during the semester? So I might be able to answer that one, and Joanna, feel free to chime in. Joanna will feel free to chime in also. So we've actually done it in a variety of different ways. We've done it where we broke up the modules across different classes. We've presented everything at once. So what that means is the students typically spend about an hour, I'd say an hour to an hour and a half on modules 1 and 2 combined. And then module 3 will take the entire class time, and we've done that in either an hour time span or in an hour and a half. But what we've actually found is that students tend to continue working on module 3 after class. We actually found that students really like to talk to each other about these things, and they end up scheduling time either on their own to continue working on it, or sometimes instructors will schedule additional time for students to finish the team documents. But it really is pretty adaptable to different types of classroom situations. You can either try to do everything all at once, assign everything at once right before as like a homework, modules 1 and 2, and then do module 3 all in one class time, or you can sort of split them up across several different classes, and it's worked in all different types of contexts.
Yeah, and I'll just point out, so this requires a little bit increased coordination with the instructor, which is far from a bad thing. This really works, and the instructor has to buy into assigning the homework as well. We have not really encountered any resistance on that. The instructors are kind of like, oh, if I'm giving a class period over to this anyway, the added homework is not much. Mm-hmm. And we have implemented, and the instructor's response to these revised workshops has been fantastic. The original workshops had really good classroom reception. Students were engaged during the workshops. The instructors loved them. They continued inviting us year after year. We just found that the uptake, and at least students knew when things failed. We had some evidence that they remembered the workshop, and so they had a framework for thinking about how they could go into the future with that. But after Maria revised this workshop, I would get emails from the instructors saying just how wonderful it was and how proud I should be of Maria as my student. So we have also implemented this flipped workshop into many other workshops that we provided. So our workshop on designing PowerPoint slides, we changed into a flipped module where we delivered a lecture beforehand, like a 15-minute video, had students bring in some slides, and then spent class time reviewing, adding more to what had been in the video, and having students peer review each other. And it just made a huge difference in student take-up of what we taught.
Mm-hmm.
May I say something?
Les, please.
Hi, my name's Laura Alexander. I have tried working with these kinds of agreement documents with my students before, with variable effects. One thing that I have noticed is sometimes the students will create the document and they will seem very pleased with it. And they'll seem to, they want to agree with me and they want to please me. And so they'll be like, yeah, this is great. And they'll do it. And then as we're going through, and I'm sort of checking in with them as we're going through the semester and whatever, what I'll basically discover is that they like never refer to it again. Like it was a one-off. And so I'm trying to think of ways to get them to be referring to it. And maybe I need to bring that part into the classroom, like, okay, everyone take out your documents and let's spend a few minutes in class talking about how well we've worked with it, or I don't know. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, on getting them to actually do it after they've created it.
Maria, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I'm actually not surprised, even with the flipped workshop, as well as it worked for students to plan ahead, which is essentially what we really wanted students to do, is to really take planning ahead of time seriously. It still was a problem where students might not always refer back to it later on. So I really am not surprised that that's happening, Laura. I think it's a common problem when you have these kinds of activities where students are like, yeah, this is really great. And then, they kind of forget about it as the project moves along. Honestly, the thing that kind of popped into my mind, and I have not done this yet, but the thing that popped into my mind as you were talking is to give students sort of situations, almost like prompting them into putting them in situations where, their values might be at odds again. So putting them in a situation where, they have to offer feedback on something that, is completely different from, like either the project. Yeah, kind of like running scenarios, exactly. But like putting them in those scenarios, or even giving them sometimes just a scenario in the middle of the project and having them, try to figure out what would be the best response for their team. And yeah, precisely. So I think that might be ways to kind of get students to think back on, oh wait, what was it that my peer would really value in this situation? What was it that they said? Because I don't remember. What was it that I even said? Sometimes we don't even remember what we thought about, those situations. So that might be my suggestion, to do something like that. I think based on what we found with the scenarios, that students really like them and they respond well to them. But once again, I have not tested anything like that. I think that's a problem that keeps occurring even with my own work, and I'm still trying to figure out how to get students to do it. But Joanna, go ahead, take away. You might have some pretty great advice too.
Well, one thing that has changed my practice, and I just put a link to it, is Chris Lamb's wonderful article. It's More Than a Feeling, where he talks about data-driven team projects. And so I've started implementing it. I do a little bit different than Chris, but about halfway through the project, I have students fill out a questionnaire and do it anonymously for each team, and just sort of say, how well is this going? Rank it on a scale of 1 to 5, then have them provide some comments and feedback. And it's really interesting because teams that look like they were going well, there's actually a little bit of friction that was buried beneath the surface. And that becomes a natural point for the team to go back and look at the team charter or look at the task schedule and make some plans. And since I've started doing that, that's gone very well and has definitely increased sort of the natural uptake of those documents. I want to refer to a couple comments and questions that are in the chat. Someone asked about team science and if we brought in any of the literature on that. And when I am selling things to students, I've started more and more bringing in some of the research on collective intelligence. And collective intelligence, so it's something that you can measure, like a collective IQ for the group. That is not just the sum of the individual IQ scores of people. And one of the things that correlates most strongly with collective intelligence is egalitarian participation, which makes sense. If you get viewpoints, you get more, equal participation, more equal conversation, more equal viewpoints from other people. You're leveraging all of these different perspectives and you get higher collective intelligence. And so I bring in some of that framework. I have like a one-page handout where I've summarized some of that research and use that as vocabulary when I'm giving feedback to teams about whether or not they're leveraging their collective intelligence. And I make a case in my classes that the planning documents, that is how you leverage, collective intelligence just doesn't emerge on its own. You have to plan in order to reap those benefits. I also bring in some work. There's an article called "The Science of Meetings," I think it is, that reviews all of the workshops or all of the research that has been done on meetings, shows huge benefits for meetings that have an agenda, planning in the meeting, again, egalitarian conversation that isn't dominated. So that's some ways that I bring in some of that research in your book. Okay. What else? There was a comment from Roz that I wanted to address. I'm not. Oh, you mentioned that failures of communication and coordination are one of the major human factors associated with accidents and high risk things. And yes, I just want to affirm this. And this is reminding me of a wonderful article that did some research on oil rigs and offshore oil rigs, which are a very high risk environment, as we know from like some of these oil spills, very prone to accidents. And these researchers went to oil rigs and worked. It's also very, very masculine, highly masculine setting where we might judge some of the commonplaces in there as kind of toxic masculinity, being hero, being dominant, being the one who's in charge. And they work to deliberately, undo some of those things and create psychological safety, a place where people where talking about mistakes became part of routine, something that they did. They would review sort of safety lapses that they saw sort of on a regular basis. And by implementing these practices, they decreased accidents by about 80% and had a corresponding increase in profits. So these can be great when you're working with engineering students, is like really practical ways of why egalitarianism, it's not just like, a touchy-feely thing. No, it's like better, and leads to better outcomes.